So the readings from Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 31. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters, to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. Amen.
So as I said just now, as you may have guessed from Bible reading, this isn't going to be like a normal sermon. A little while ago, Bolton Road had a preaching series on what the Bible says about various topics, and I was asked to look at what some people see as a conflict between the Christian faith and science, and preach on what the Bible says about science. To be honest, I was a bit dubious about this. I think, I thought that was going to go. As you might be feeling a bit dubious now about how this is going to go. But yeah, I wasn't sure how it was going to be received. In fact, actually, it was received very well. I mean, people said, "Oh, that was really," that was, people did actually find it really interesting. I mean, probably not everybody did, but a lot of people did. In fact, some people actually asked, for copies of the sermon to send to other people. So anyway, so I thought, well, seeing it went down quite well there, it'd be a shame not to share it with you, and I've already shared it with a few other churches in the circuit. Some people seem to think, that faith in God is incompatible with modern science. Some people seem to think you can't be a scientist and a Christian. But I have a scientific background, and I keep abreast of sort of latest theories and stuff. Probably think it's a bit sad, but never mind. I can reassure you I am most certainly a Christian. You're probably pleased to hear. I believe that being a Christian is entirely compatible with science. And the science, more than that, science can actually be used to virtually prove, not completely, obviously, but virtually prove that a creator, God, exists. And I'm going to explain why I believe this. If you're one of those people who are experiencing a conflict between your Christian beliefs and science, then hopefully this will help. And if you're not, then great, but hopefully you will still find the facts and logic sort of affirming, or at least interesting. And you may, as I said just now, you might be able to sort of use this in your armoury. When you come across somebody, maybe a friend, a relative, or someone who said, "Oh, I don't believe in God because of science," etc., etc. You say, but, and then you can just drop a few little facts in on them, and maybe at least get them saying, okay, right, it's interesting. So, let's start by looking at that account of creation in Genesis, and then we'll look at the evolution of humans, and Adam and Eve, and finally we'll look at why it's virtually impossible for life to exist just by chance, without a creator. So, let's start by comparing the account of creation in Genesis with what science says happened. First, we need to note that the writer of Genesis, who incidentally is generally thought to be Moses, described creation as happening in 6 days. Now, straight away, that can be like a massive stumbling block, because there's lots of scientific evidence, not least carbon dating, that indicates that humans were not living on Earth 6 days after the universe was created. In fact, science tells us it was nearly 14 billion years, a lot longer than 6 days. But some people straight away say, that's the two are completely incompatible. But they're not. The way I think about it is that Moses couldn't possibly have been able to comprehend billions of years. He only had 10 fingers to count on. So it's easy to see how he described each period of time as a day, because this is what they understood at that time. Talk about days, morning, evening, instead of actually periods of billions of years. If we accept that each day was a period, it then all starts to fall into place and make sense. The Bible tells us that in the beginning God created heaven and earth. By this the Bible means everything, what we now call the universe. And right at the beginning of the Gospel of John, we're told that through God all things were made. Science now tells us that the universe started with what they call the Big Bang. and has been expanding ever since. The Big Bang, it's almost it's impossible to really imagine it. It was an infinitely dense and hot point. A tiny little point, say infinitely hot, infinitely dense. And it's called a space-time singularity. And this just appeared from nowhere and expanded very rapidly. Within a fraction of a second, all the matter and energy in the whole universe had been created. The question is, where did that little infinitely hot, dense thing come from? The most plausible answer seems to be what the Bible tells us. That God put it there. We cannot prove that this is true, but on the other hand, science will never be able to prove that it's not true. That's because it's impossible to determine what was there before a singularity. By its very nature of a space-time singularity, you cannot prove what was before it because everything just gets so scrunched up. You can't see what was it like before. So nobody can scientifically prove where the universe did or did not come from. I have seen conjecture recently by some well-known scientists saying, "Oh well, you could see that maybe," but it is just conjecture. It can't be proved. So although science doesn't actually prove that God created the Big Bang, it does create a very strong case for it being created by something. And that something, of course, we know as God. Also, as God was obviously there before the Big Bang, so he could create it, this gives us a fascinating glimpse of the awesome nature of God. Science tells us that before the Big Bang, the 4 dimensions that we know today, including time, did not exist. So science confirms what the Bible tells us, that God is omnipresent and timeless. That God operates outside the constraints of time and the physical dimensions that we can comprehend. Or, as it says in the Bible, the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Also in this period, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. As the universe expanded from the Big Bang, atomic particles started to bump into each other and produce light. Then atoms were attracted to each other through gravitational forces to form massive stars, which gave off huge amounts of light, and still do, of course. So, the science and Bible agree about this too. In the second period, the Bible tells us that God made a vault and separated the water under the vault from the earth above it. God called the vault sky. When the earth was formed, scientific theory suggests that the water was created at the same time as the rocks were, and some of them also came from asteroids and comets and things like that. But when the earth was very warm, which was the beginning when it was first created, water wouldn't have existed in liquid form. It had all just been in vapour above the surface of the earth. But when the earth started cooling down, that vapour started condensing and it would come down as rain, like it does today, and forms sort of water on the surface of the earth. But there's still some as clouds in the sky, and that's what Moses had seen through what God had told him. Water in the sky, what we call clouds, separated from the water on the surface of the earth. In the third period, the Bible tells us that God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let dry ground appear." Science tells us that 3.75 billion years ago, the oceans and the continents started to form. So yet again, the Bible and science are in agreement. Also in this period, the Bible tells us that God created plant life. Now the author of Genesis then goes off, sort of starts talking about all different forms of plants, which of course did eventually become created. However, plant life at that time of creation, in that period, was just little single-celled algae. The significant thing is that the first form of life on Earth was plant life, about which Bible and science agrees. In the fourth period, God said, let there be lights in the sky to separate the sky from the night. Sorry, from the day from the night. This, when you read it, it's a bit puzzling. You think, well, hang on a bit. A few days ago, light was first created. How come it's being created again now? You think, what's going on here? It's a bit confusing, but it's likely that when the Earth was first formed, the atmosphere was opaque. So basically, you couldn't see the sun, the moon, and the stars. It was all just like a nasty sort of like glowing, blurry mist, like a sort of really foggy day. But as the Earth continued to cool, and as the plant life was starting to give off oxygen, then the atmosphere would become clear, and suddenly the sun and the stars and the moon would have been able to be seen. Not, of course, with anybody actually, no people there to actually see it at the time, but they would have become visible. In the fifth period, God created every living thing with which the water teems that moves about in it, and every winged bird. A fossil shows that complex living creatures did in fact first develop in the sea, and so there's complete agreement there. And of course then Moses went on and then described all the other sorts of things that live in the sea. The confusion a little bit is the birds. Because birds weren't formed then. I mean, birds weren't formed until much, much later on. So hang on, where are the birds? Is that wrong? It's a bit confusing, but people seem to think that it could have meant insects. Well, it could have been just Moses confused because he saw the sea and he saw the seabirds on it. We don't know. But certainly insects. There were flying insects at the time. And maybe flying fish as well. In the sixth period, God said, let the land produce living creatures. Again, science tells us that once life developed in the sea, it started emerging, looking a bit like that, emerging from the water onto land. So once again, complete agreement. So we've seen that the Bible's account in Genesis of the creation of life on earth agrees very closely with what science tells us. Fine. But what we need to remember is that there's no way that the people of that time, in Moses' time, could have possibly have known the order in which life on earth was created. It was just completely beyond their comprehension. And yet they wrote it down. Maybe not completely accurately, because they may not be able to really understand what God was telling them. But largely, broadly, they wrote down exactly the order in which life on earth was created. They couldn't have known that, which shows that God must have told Moses what had happened. So once again, science indicates that God exists. Let's now look at evolution and the origin of humans. That's always been a very testing one. It's one that maybe there's a lot of argument about, isn't there, about theory, evolution, etc. When Darwin came up with the theory of evolution, he was looking at how single species adapted to changing environments through natural selection was often called the survival of the fittest. It seems obvious to me that God would have included some form of evolution into his design. When you think about it, even modern car engines and automatic gearboxes and all sorts of other things have evolution. They adapt to how they're used, whatever. So if people can design that sort of stuff, then I'm sure, I'd never doubt that God would be able to design that into his creation. So, that isn't surprising that creation has that ability to adapt and evolve. But Darwin and others then sort of massively, in my opinion, over-extrapolated that theory to cover the evolution of absolutely everything from the first single-celled creature that all just happened by accident. When I look at the incredible complexity of living creatures, it just seems, just like us, us own bodies, it just seems impossible to me that it could have happened by chance. When we think about how our brains work, how our ears work, how our eyes work, how we reproduce, the incredibly fine balance of chemicals that allow us to live, and all the amazing things about our bodies. I really can't believe that happened by chance from a little tiny bit of plant life living in an ocean. Can you? I can't. To me, it seems blindingly obvious that we were designed by a supremely intelligent being, who we now know as God, as it tells us in Genesis. Now, God may have chosen to create all living creatures from that first bit of algae. The fact that we share half our DNA with a banana tree, do you know that? There you go. Suggests that in some way we do have a common ancestor. But it doesn't matter how God created us. The important thing is that God did create us to be in his likeness, exactly as we are. What about Adam and Eve? Again, a contentious point for many people. All I need to say, I think, is that scientists have examined the DNA from people throughout the world on the mother's side, and guess what? They've traced it back to a single woman who lived about 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. A single woman living in Africa. Even the scientists call that person Eve. So once again, science does seem to indicate that the Bible is correct. We're now going to look at the third and final thing, and why it's virtually impossible for the universe, and certainly not life, to exist just by chance. This is where it gets a little bit complicated in places. So you can switch off a little bit and I'll bring it to an end. Yeah, so I'll tell you what the conclusion is. During the last few decades, the more we discovered about physics, the stronger the argument for the existence of a creator God. Because you think it's the other way around, but it's not. It's actually, the more we know, the more there seems to need to be a creator. This has been shown that the fundamental forces that govern the universe are just incredibly finely tuned to allow us to exist. One example is a strong nuclear force which holds atoms together. If this force was weaker by 1 in 10 to the power of 30, then the only element in the universe that exists was helium. And so life obviously wouldn't exist. Now 10 to the power of 30 is a million, trillion. I've not counted them myself, but I've heard that that's far more than the grains of sand in the world, included in all the deserts like the Sahara. Another is the ratio between electromagnetic and gravitational forces. If you increase it by only 1 part in 10 to the power of 40, then only small stars will form. Decrease it by the same amount, and only large stars will form. Now you say, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters because for life to exist, there must both be large stars, which produce all the fundamental material like oxygen, carbon, the metals, etc. And also for small stars to exist, like the sun, that burn for much longer and allows the orbiting planets to have life on them, like the Earth. And the probability of the weak nuclear force permitting life is even smaller. It's 1 in 10 to the power of 100. And if you're struggling to imagine what that number is, that is far more than the number of atomic particles in the entire universe. So that's a pretty big number. But most remarkable of all is Roger Penrose, an amazing theoretical physicist, states that for life to exist, the universe must have had exactly the correct initial entropy, with a volume of phase space precise to 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. Now, if you thought those other numbers are big, I mean, that is just sort of, just bonkers, that number. I mean, that is, as far as anybody's concerned, that's infinity. Now, what do you get when this isn't just things by themselves. When you times all those together, plus all the other things like Planck's constant and all the other things, then you get a level of improbability that just makes it clear how really extremely unlikely it is that we're just here by chance. Let's put it another way. Science tells us the laws of physics are what control the universe. But how is it that these laws are so incredibly fine-tuned that they allow us to be here talking about them? Science doesn't have an answer for that. But to us it's obvious, isn't it? It's what we read in Genesis. God created the universe, and he created it with exactly the right physics to enable us to be here worshipping him as our creator. It might be the laws of physics that define the universe, but it was God who wrote them. And I actually have used that argument with somebody who was sort of shouting, sort of telling me about science in an argument against God. And I said, yeah, but who wrote those laws of physics? Oh, yeah. I only met him once and at a dinner, so I don't know whether it made any difference, but you never know. Now, some people claim that there's an infinite number of universes and we just happen to be on the one where everything is just perfectly right for us to exist. Just in the same way as you get an infinite number of monkeys sat at typewriters would turn out the entire works of Shakespeare. But when people start coming up with theories like that, I think, yeah, whatever. You're just clutching at straws. You've got no real answer. What's more likely? An infinite number of parallel universes, all just very slightly differently, or a creator God? I think I know which I think is most likely. So, I hope now that you can see, just a conclusion. If science isn't your thing and you want to be a bit over your head and all the big numbers and things over your head, just remember this. The chances of life existing in the universe by chance is so incredibly small as to make it impossible. Remember that box of Legos now? And I said, what's the chance of me shaking it up? And he said, 0. There's more chance of that happening than the universe happening by accident, just by chance. And therefore, the only rational answer is that there is a grand designer, a creator, who, of course, we know as God. So I hope you can see that why believing in God is entirely compatible with science. And the science can be used to show how extremely likely it is that there is a creator God. I'm going to finish with a quote from possibly the most famous scientist of all time, Albert Einstein, who said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." It's debatable what he actually meant. Nobody actually seemed to have the courage to actually ask him exactly what he meant, or perhaps he didn't tell them. But it does suggest that he believed that not only is a belief in God compatible with science, but that they actually complement each other, which is actually what we've been talking about this morning. Let's pray. Oh dear Lord, we're sorry if we're ever blind to your power and glory. Perhaps blinded by the foolishness of people who claim to be wise. Perhaps blinded because we limit what we think is possible to our own understanding. Help us, Lord, to never doubt that you created the universe. Help us to never doubt that you are all-powerful, all-intelligent, omnipresent, and eternal. Help us to see you in everything that you have created, from the vastness of the galaxies to the beautiful and intricate creatures that live on this planet. And Lord, we pray that you'll give us the words we need to convince others that you are their creator. Help us to use the overwhelming evidence that you give us to defeat their mistaken so-called scientific views. Amen.